Hello everyone, Mr. Linder here. Let's talk about the cardiac cycle of the heart. So the cardiac cycle represents the contraction and relaxation of the heart. And this contraction and relaxation of the heart really only takes about zero point 0.8 of a second. So what we're looking at is essentially a relaxation and a contraction cycle that allows the heart to pump blood out into the cardiovascular system. So we divide the cardiac cycle into two phases, the systole phase and the diastole phase. The diastole phase of the heart is essentially the relaxation phase of the heart, so when the cardiac muscle is not contracting. The systole phase of the cardiac cycle is the time when the cardiac muscle is contracting. Essentially, one cardiac cycle represents a heartbeat. So it represents a series of contraction and relaxation of the atria and the ventricles. In order for blood to flow through the heart, there needs to be changes in the volume of the chambers, which essentially leads to changes in pressure of blood within the heart, and those pressure changes allow the blood to move from one location to another. In essence, when the volume of the heart, so let's say a chamber is decreasing in size, so the volume of the chamber is decreasing, there will be a subsequent increase in pressure. So as the chamber size gets smaller, then the pressure can increase within the chamber, and then we can begin to move blood. Blood flow is going to occur from areas of high pressure, so high pressure, to areas of low pressure. So if the heart can generate a higher amount of pressure, then blood can move from one area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. And so what we essentially will see is the movement of blood through the heart, and then eventually the movement of blood out to the lungs and out to the body. Before I go through the phases of the cardiac cycle, I want to give you a little bit more vocabulary. A term that you'll want to be familiar with is EDV. This acronym stands for in diastolic volume. And the in diastolic volume is the total volume of blood in the ventricles at the end of diastole. Another term you want to be familiar with is the acronym SV, or stroke volume. Stroke volume is the amount of blood ejected from the ventricles each time the heart goes through systole, so each time that there's a contraction. So it's essentially the amount of blood that's being pumped out of the heart. The in-systolic volume, the ESV, is the amount of blood left in the ventricles at the end of systole. So after the heart has contracted, there will be a certain amount of blood that remains in the heart, and we will call that the end systolic volume. So let's go through the cardiac cycle and look at the phases that the heart is going through in order to move blood through the heart and then out to the lungs and out to the body. So I like to begin looking at the cardiac cycle when the heart is at rest. So essentially in a late diastole. So essentially, when you're in this late period of diastole, both the atria and the ventricles are at rest. And when the heart is at rest, you essentially have a zero pressure in the heart. Now, it's not exactly zero pressure, but we're going to make an assumption here that when the heart is at rest, the pressure is essentially zero. And if the pressure is essentially zero, then blood can return to the heart. So in the diagram, what we're looking at is we're looking at the superior vena cava and blood flowing through there. We're looking at the inferior vena cava and blood flowing through there. We're looking at pulmonary veins bringing blood back to the heart. And so as blood returns to the heart, because the pressure in the heart is essentially zero, so if you have higher pressure out in the veins and lower pressure within the heart, blood can flow into the heart. And because the heart is at rest, what we notice is that the atrioventricular valves are open. Those are the valves that are between the atria and the ventricles. This would be known as the tricuspid. I'll put a T here for tricuspid valve, and this one is the bicuspid or mitral valve. And because those atrioventricular valves are open and blood is returning to the heart, what we actually see is blood flowing down into the ventricles passively. So this is essentially passive filling of the ventricles. And so what I like to do on this particular diagram is kind of show you that blood is filling the ventricles. And it's actually filling the ventricles, not all the way, but a good percentage of the ventricular chambers are filling while the heart is at rest, while it's in diastole. So you actually have blood entering the ventricles before they're actually filling up the atria. And this is because those AV valves are open, and because of gravity, blood's going to flow from the top portion of the heart down into the lower portion of the heart. So during this time of diastole, we have blood flowing into the heart, and we get essentially passive filling of the ventricles. The next phase to look at when we look at the cardiac cycle is atrial systole. And the reason atrial systole is going to take place is so that we can maximize the filling of the ventricles. So most of the blood has basically entered the ventricles during that passive filling, but as the atrioventricular valves begin to close, so as blood has been filling up into the ventricles, it's sort of floating those atrioventricular valves closed. And now as blood is returning to the heart, so we still have blood coming into the heart, the atrial chambers can begin to fill up with blood. Now, the atrial chambers are not going to fill the ventricles. They're going to add blood to the ventricles. We already know that, let's say the ventricles are essentially about 80% full. We already know that blood has entered into the ventricles. What atrial systole is going to do, the contraction of the atria, that's going to maximize the filling of the ventricles. So during atrial systole, the atria are going to go through their contraction cycle. They're going to push, let's say, another 20% of blood into the ventricles. So we'll label that as another 20% of blood. So they're going to push about a 20% of blood volume into the ventricles so that we maximize the filling of the ventricles. If you were looking at this phase of the cardiac cycle on an electrocardiogram, so what we call an ECG, if you were looking at the ECG, we'd be in the P wave. So the P wave essentially is the depolarization of the atria as we lead to contraction of the atria. So during the P wave on the ECG, we are depolarizing the atria, we're triggering contraction of the atria, and that atrial systole is maximizing the filling of the ventricle. So now that the ventricles have their maximum amount of volume, we would say they have the end diastolic volume. So we have essentially established the end diastolic volume for the ventricles, and now we can start looking at contraction of the ventricles and eventually the stroke volume, the pumping of blood out of the heart. So let's move to the next phase, which is called isovolumetric ventricular contraction. So isovolumetric ventricular contraction is the ventricles going through a state of contraction, but we're not actually ejecting blood yet. What we're doing in isovolumetric ventricular contraction is we are decreasing the volume of the ventricles, right? So we're decreasing the volume of the ventricles. So the chamber volume is getting smaller, but the blood volume is not changing. And so that's where the word isovolumetric comes from. It's not talking about the size of the ventricles. We know the size of the ventricles when they begin to start their contraction. The size of the ventricles is going to get smaller, but the volume of blood that is in the ventricles is currently not changing. So why is the volume within the ventricles not changing? Well, our AV valves are closed, and this is where we're going to get the first heart sound. So this is what we're going to call the lub sound of the heart. Okay? So the first heart sound is lub, and that's because these AV valves essentially snap shut so that blood cannot go back into the atria, right? We don't want blood backflowing into the atria. You're also going to notice, though, that your semilunar valves are closed. So this is the pulmonary semilunar, this is the aortic semilunar. So this is preventing blood from going out to the lungs. This is preventing blood from going out to the body through the aorta when those semilunar valves are closed. So if all the valves are closed, then the volume of blood within the heart cannot change, hence isovolumetric. Okay, the volume of blood cannot change. But since the volume of the ventricles, right, the chamber is getting smaller, if the chamber is getting smaller, we're increasing the pressure of the blood inside the ventricles. And so if the pressure is going up, eventually we'll be able to move blood out of the heart. So to kind of summarize what's going on in isovolumetric ventricular contraction, we're starting to go through ventricular systole. So as the ventricles are beginning to contract, the AV valves are closing. And as the AV valves are closing, that's going to create the first heart sound. That's what we call the lub sound. So when you're auscultating or listening to the heart, we get lub. If we were looking at this on an ECG, this would be happening basically after the QRS complex. So the QRS complex is the depolarization of the ventricles, and following the depolarization of the ventricles is the contraction of the ventricles. As the volume of the chambers are getting smaller, the pressure within the ventricles is rising, and eventually that pressure will become too great for the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve to hold the blood back. But currently, there's not enough pressure yet, but that pressure is building and building and building. So currently, we have the end-diastolic volume within the heart, but the pressure of that blood is going up, and that leads us into the next phase. So the next phase of the cardiac cycle is the ventricular ejection phase. And the ventricular ejection phase, like the term implies, we're going to eject blood from the ventricles. So basically the heart is pumping and we're going to move blood into the pulmonary trunk. So we have ventricular ejection. So we have blood leaving the right ventricle, and that blood is being pumped to the lungs. So we're going to say here, we're going out to the lungs here. That's our pulmonary circuit, and out this way. So blood is ejecting from the right ventricle out to the lungs. And then we also have blood leaving the left ventricle, and that's being pumped into the aorta. So it's going past the aortic semilunar valve. So what's happening is the semilunar valves are opening and blood is moving into the pulmonary trunk and into the aorta. And if blood is going into the aorta, then we know it's going out into the systemic system. So blood is being pumped to the lungs and blood is being pumped out to the body. Why does that happen? Because we built up high pressure in the ventricles and it's moving out to areas that have lower pressure. So pulmonary trunk and aorta have a lower pressure compared to the ventricles, and so we're getting ejection of blood. The atrioventricular valves are going to remain closed. And those have to stay closed so we don't get backflow of blood into the atria. The volume of blood that you're pumping is called the stroke volume. Okay, so what we're pumping out of the right ventricle and out of the left ventricle is the stroke volume. And the stroke volume is relatively equal on the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart. So basically, what I'm saying is that the right side of the heart is pumping, let's say it's pumping 80 milliliters of blood. And if the right side is pumping 80 milliliters of blood, then the left side is pumping 80 milliliters of blood. So the stroke volume is relatively equal as you move blood to the lungs and as you move blood out to the body. What's different between the blood that's going to the lungs and the blood that's going to the body is the pressure. The right side of the heart pumps at a lower pressure than the left side of the heart. So the pressure going to the lungs is going to be, let's say, 30 millimeters of mercury, a lower pressure, and the pressure that's being pumped out to the body is going to be 120 millimeters of mercury. So the right and left ventricle pump relatively the same stroke volume, but they're going to be pumping at different pressures. And that should make sense. We don't want to send too much pressure to our lungs. That would damage the blood vessels in the lungs. But we need to have a higher pressure being pumped out to the body so that we can send blood throughout our arms, legs, abdomen, head, etc. So pumping the same volume, but pumping at different pressures. The last phase of the cardiac cycle is isovolumetric relaxation. So isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. And during this phase is when you get the second heart sound. So blood has been ejected out to the lungs, out to the body, and now the ventricles are going to start to relax. They're going to go into their repolarization state. If you were looking at an ECG, on an ECG, we would be looking at the T wave of the ECG. So as the ventricles go through repolarization, that's when we're in this isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. That would be a T wave on the ECG. So ventricular pressure is dropping. That means, though, that the blood that has exited the heart, so blood that's in the pulmonary circuit and blood that's in the systemic circuit, is actually going to be now at a higher pressure than the pressure in the ventricles. So what happens is blood tries to return to the heart, but as blood tries to return to the heart, your pulmonary semilunar valve and your aortic semilunar valve are going to snap shut, and that's going to give you your second heart sound. So this is what we would call the dup sound. So we have the lub-dup sound as you auscultate the heart. So blood trying to return to the heart is prevented because the semilunar valves are closing. And of course, our atrioventricular valves are still closed. And so if all four valves are closed again, that means that we're in a state where the amount of blood within the heart cannot change again. And so the residual blood that's still left within the heart would be our end systolic volume. That's the volume of blood that remains in the heart after systole. And that volume currently can't change because all four valves are closed again. So to summarize, isovolumetric ventricular relaxation is blood has left the heart, blood tries to return to the heart, but the semilunar valves close, so that gives us the dup sound. We now have the in-systolic volume in the heart, and that's the amount of blood that's still remaining within the heart. And we have a sealed chamber, so currently the volume cannot change. What's going to happen next, though, is that the atrioventricular valves are going to begin to relax. And so as these AV valves begin to relax and open back up, then we are essentially moving back to the beginning of the next cardiac cycle. So we're moving back to that state of diastole, where the heart essentially now has a zero pressure again, and blood can flow from the veins back into the heart as long as the veins have a higher pressure than the heart. And so we're back to the beginning of the next cardiac cycle. So again, the cardiac cycle is this less than 1 second event where we go through systole and diastole of the atria and the ventricles. The next diagram I want to show you is known as the Wiggers diagram. And the Wiggers diagram will be of interest to you because it allows you to see the electrocardiogram. So we can see the P wave, the QRS, and the T wave. So we can focus in on the electrical events of the heart. And it correlates with the cardiac cycle. So this is the cardiac cycle from a visual standpoint. So we can look at how the heart, right, is going through the various phases of the cardiac cycle. And then what you can also see is the pressure changes that are taking place within the ventricles of the heart. And so we can see the changes in pressure, and then we can also see the changes in volume that are taking place within specifically the left ventricle of the heart. And so you can see where the stroke volume occurs, right? So here we have the in diastolic volume, the amount of blood that's in the heart when the heart has completed its diastole. We can see the end systolic volume. And so the difference between the two, if you were to take the end diastolic volume minus the end systolic volume, you would be able to calculate the stroke volume. And so you can see the amount of blood that's being pumped, specifically from the left ventricle, but we know that the volumes are relatively equal between the left side and the right side. So this would be the stroke volume, the amount of blood that's being pumped out during the cardiac cycle. And then you can also look at the pressure changes that are taking place as the pressure builds up so that you can get ejection of blood from the left ventricle. You can also see the pressure changes in the aorta as blood is moved into the aorta as it's being ejected from the heart. So the Wiggers diagram is a nice diagrammatic summary of the cardiac cycle, and then also giving you an opportunity to look at where are the electrical events occurring, what are some of the pressure changes that are occurring, and what are some of the volume changes that are taking place from a diagrammatic standpoint. So that is the cardiac cycle. I hope that helps. Take care.